We're recording. Here we go. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. A few other people might be trickling in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. If you all could introduce yourself in the chat with your name, organization, personal pronouns if you're comfortable sharing them, and where you're based. We encourage you to include a recognition of the Indigenous land that you reside on. And if you're unsure, we have a link to a map that you can look at. Shade, if you want to go to the next slide, you can. So welcome to our third and final session of a three-part series. My name is Erin Kanzig. I'm the River Programs Fellow at River Network. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Detroit, Michigan, although I'm currently in Sisters, Oregon, land of the Wasco, Warm Springs, and Paiute peoples. If you want to go to the next slide, Shada, that'd be great. So for today's agenda, we're just going to do intros right now. I'm going to do a very, very quick recap on session 2, and then we'll be turning over to two excellent speakers today. We've got Denise Schmidt with EPIC and Larry Levine with NRDC. And then we'll have plenty of time at the end for question and answer and discussion with you all. Next slide. So for a quick refresh, our first session was a 2-hour deep dive into the basics of SRFs. And then the second session, we covered opportunities to influence the SRF process, including through intended use plans. If you missed either of those sessions, they are available on our website and YouTube channel, and we can share the link to those in the chat. This slide is just a really quick and dirty on last session. So we talked about intended use plans, also known as IUPs, and where advocates can plug in, including around public comment periods, encouraging you all to get involved early in that process, partnering with local governments, and also connecting with other advocates in other states, which is part of the goal of these training sessions as well, is to make those connections with each other. We also heard from Janet on principal forgiveness, defining disadvantaged communities and affordability criteria. And she went over some differences between states and how you all can work to advocate for defining those different criterias. So that's my quick overview from last time. And again, if you want to review or see those presentations for the first time, we have those available online. Can you go to the next slide, Shada? Thanks. So Shada and I are your facilitators for today with River Network. And then we have two guest speakers. We'll be talking with Denise Schmidt. She is the director of EPIC's Funding Navigator, a program to ensure that more water utilities that serve overburdened communities receive state and federal funds for water infrastructure. Denise is pretty new to EPIC, but she has over 30 years of experience working with utilities, local, state, and federal agencies, technical assistance providers, and nonprofits. She was most recently the administrator of the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin's Division of Water Utility Regulation and Analysis. So she brings with her a lot of rich experiences that we'll be hearing about today. And then our second speaker is Larry Levine. He is a senior attorney and director with NRDC on urban water infrastructure and their Healthy People and Thriving Communities program. Larry advocates for strong enforcement of and improvement of funding for national, state, and local policies on urban water quality, water infrastructure, and affordable access to safe and sufficient water and sanitation. So we will be turning it over to Denise first, and then Larry. Thank you both for being with us here today. And if you all have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll make sure we get to them at some point during our discussion. All right, thank you.
I'm going to do an ungraceful transfer to Denise's slide, so bear with me for a second. Are you all seeing that? Great. Move us into reach.
I'm not sure it's in the slide mode yet. There we go. Thank you.
Are you seeing just the slide, or are you seeing?
I'm seeing slides and notes.
Okay, let me try that again.
Well, while we're sorting through the technical issues, I'll say good morning to everybody. I'm Denise Schmidt. As Erin introduced me, I'm delighted to have joined EPIC just a couple weeks ago now as the director of its funding navigator, a new program to connect underserved communities and overburdened communities with revolving funds and other state and federal funds to support water infrastructure. From my perch at the Public Service Commission, where I spent about almost 10 years, I saw a lot, worked with a lot of utilities, roughly over 575 utilities, small, medium, large sized, and really saw, we oversaw the rates and the service standards, kind of the customer facing, what the deal is between a utility and its customers, if you will. And really time and time again, saw where the rubber meets the road is in projects and how they get funded and how things get paid for matters so very much in terms of affordability. So while I'm new to EPIC, I'm not new to this topic, and I'm delighted to be here talking with you all. Next slide, please. So I'm going to split my talk into two different components here. So I'm going to start with what really are the underpinnings of the Water Affordability Challenge, such a hot topic in our industry across the country. And then second, how does the federal government, especially the State Revolving Fund program, you'll hear me refer to SRF, kind of abbreviating that program, can help address water affordability challenges. Next slide, please. So I'll start with the affordability challenge. And Shada, if you don't mind clicking through. So when we talk about affordability, there are two components. First, we talk about the household affordability. What does a customer, the residents in that community, what do they see in terms of the burden they're facing with paying for their water and wastewater bills? When we talk about household affordability, what we're talking about is the ability of those residents to pay for adequate water services without undue hardship. So there are multiple pieces there, right? Access and paying low rates for inadequate service and substandard reliability is not affordable water. At the same time, having sort of a Cadillac system is not, that creates undue hardship. That's also not an affordable water situation for residents. Next click, please. So our research shows that 10 to 30% of households spend more than 1 day of labor a month to pay their water bills. And I'll just take a note. That's one way to look at affordability challenges at the household level. There are other ways to look at it too, like what percentage of the monthly income, et cetera. The point is, I think when we start talking about affordability, like many things in water utility world, it's a hyper-local issue, right? There are many confounding factors that can affect an ability of an individual to pay for water or anything else. Next click, please. And unaffordable bills can lead to all sorts of things, right? Customers with late fees that mount up and are unaffordable to pay. Service disconnections. Some places have moratoriums on service connections, but others do not. Others find that as a way to, some utilities use that as a way to compel payment. Next click. Financial strain on the households, of course. And then the final click is adverse health outcomes. If folks are rationing water, if you will, there can really be undue burdens in terms of health outcomes. You know, water is an essential service that underpins our health, our sanitation, et cetera. And we did have some communities in Wisconsin where the bills were so high that we heard about folks resorting to, tapping into their neighbors' water and resorting to all sorts of interesting ways to get around paying an unaffordable water bill. Next slide, please. So the other piece of the puzzle is system financial capacity. So there are systems and there are utilities. Sometimes those terms get used interchangeably, but sort of at the community level, who's providing that water, do they have the financial capacity to provide safe, reliable service and environmental safety? So next click, please. When we talk about financial capacity, we mean the ability of that utility to pay and deliver, treat water in compliance with the regulations. Next click. Again, getting back to that, if you have very low rates, but you aren't meeting regulations and providing safe, reliable service, it's not an affordable situation. So studies show that 64% of water utilities do not generate sufficient revenue to cover their costs. They perhaps have enough to get by in a given year, but can they handle undue increases in their operating costs or a needed capital expenditure? There's insufficient revenue. There are a couple different ways to look at that. Next click, please. And then that limited financial capacity can lead to all sorts of trouble at the systemic level. Unaffordable rates, of course, when you need to make that infusion of cash in the short term without much planning. Reduced investment in infrastructure. Many times, because most of our water utilities and systems are municipally owned or publicly owned, there can be real pressure at the local level to suppress rates. I've heard them sometimes referred to as, we can't increase taxes anymore. Well, we know it's not a tax system, it's a fee for service, but there can be that sort of political pressure and a concern about affordability more broadly that leads to reduced investment in infrastructure. Next click, please. Lower quality service. Not replacing mains or other distribution system components can lead to disruptions in service that really harm the community. Next slide. And then lack of compliance. Of course, Safe Drinking Water or Clean Water Act compliance. You can only go so long with deferring your investments before you get in trouble in terms of compliance. Next slide, please. So I mentioned these two components, and of course, they're inextricably linked to each other. If you have a number of households in the community and a high number of households in the community that can't afford to pay, that leads to system financial capacity. When the system is constrained, it could lead to household affordability concerns. So really, our systems are our communities in many ways. And so you can't have one that is shored up without the other being shored up and financially sustainable in the long run. Next slide, please. So there are three primary underlying causes of the affordability challenge with regards to our water systems. Next slide, please. One is the high cost of providing water services. So there are a number of these charts out there that show the increased pace of water and sewer rates and outsized compared to all other items, consumer price index, even electric utility rates and natural gas rates, telecommunication services. All of those by comparison are lower than the increase. This shows the percent increase over time in water and sewer rates. There's a lot that goes into this, operating and maintenance costs. It's a very, very capital intensive industry, much more so even than other utility services. And you put these long-lived assets in the ground, they have to get taken care of some way. And so now the bill is coming due on a lot of these systems, and that's contributing to these increases, these outsized increases in rates. Next slide, please. So when we talk about rates, there are three primary components. I kind of like to put them in these three buckets because they're the three big ones. Operations and maintenance costs. So that's your labor, your power, your chemicals, et cetera, what it takes day to day to run that utility. And then somehow a utility has to recover its capital costs, right? That can take the form of debt service. Many utilities include something that accounts for the fact that these systems don't last forever, that they deteriorate over time, and they do try to set aside something for maintaining and replacing them over time, and that's depreciation on them. Other systems will recover some capital cost recovery through a rate of return. That's more typically seen in investor-owned utilities, not the municipal systems. And then there can be taxes for private utilities, and in many cases, you see transfers to a municipality that are a payment in lieu of taxes or some other kind of transfer. These are, and this is not uncommon. You'll see that the municipality is very constrained in terms of their ability to levy taxes. And so they kind of look to the utility for some transfers based on the assets of the utility or something else. There can also be transfers back and forth that make more sense, that are more like operating costs. So it might not make sense for the utility to have its own IT department. So there'll be some transfers to and from payments to the municipality to support that. But there are also some that basically have nothing to do with water system operations that can end up in rates. And so that's something to kind of look out for at the kind of advocate level when it's rate setting time. Next slide, please. So we mentioned costs of water services are increasing, and there are a number of things that are behind that. It is a highly fragmented industry. There are a lot of numbers that get thrown around out there, 55,000 systems. I know in Wisconsin, we had 577 water public utilities. That's just on the drinking water side. And many of them serve not very many customers. So that's what when we say fragmentation, that's what we mean. There are a lot of, it makes sense, utilities are natural monopolies. It makes sense that they would be the only one providing services in that area. But when we talk about fragmentation, how big is the service area? And when you have utilities side by side, providing different service areas with the same system, is there opportunity to look at that fragmentation? Climate change indeed is affecting water utilities in terms of their operating and capital investment costs. Contaminants of emerging concern, either legacy contamination from agricultural operations or industrial operations, or emerging contaminants such as PFAS is the hot one now, of course, that is posing huge challenges. More stringent regulations that are looking at these emerging contaminants. There's kind of a patchwork quilt, as you all probably are aware of, regulations as they relate to PFAS. And so what utilities are trying to make these investment decisions, trying to figure out where some states have regulations, some do not, some are different from the EPA's kind of guidance. How do utilities kind of make plan for those things and make investment decisions? And then deteriorating infrastructure. The infrastructure, it's out of sight, out of mind for water utilities, so folks don't really think about it much. That's a problem when it comes time to garnering support for our systems. But many of them, while that buried infrastructure can last a very long time, much of the investments that were made to put what's in the ground right now were made many decades ago, and now it's time. I think AWWA and others, that's the American Water Works Association and other engineering associations talk about the bill coming due with that buried infrastructure, service lines and mains in particular. So the pipes that take the water to the house. Next slide, please. And then this shift, number two, there has been over time an increasing reliance on local ratepayers to pay for these necessary investments and increasing costs. So there's been a precipitous drop off since the 1980s. I mentioned all those initial investments with some things that were going on in the 1970s and 80s. There was an infusion of federal and state dollars into water utilities, but there's been most of that funding has not been replaced, and the burden's been picked up by water utilities and, of course, their ratepayers. Next slide, please. And then the other affordability challenge is that people just, certain people have limited resources to pay for this essential service. That includes people who work minimum wage jobs, live on fixed incomes, unemployed, seniors, people with disabilities, and then people who experience a major life event. I think, COVID really laid bare a lot of the fact that there are people who struggle to pay. For many of us, if we receive an energy bill and a water bill, we don't think that the water bill is that big a deal compared to our other bills. But for people, for this essential service, it is truly a burden for some people to pay. And I think COVID laid bare that people can come in and out of their ability to pay for these essential services. Next slide, please. And then there is just the issue that our communities are shifting and changing. There's been overall population shifts. And so I mentioned the fact that water infrastructure comes with a very high fixed cost. You pay for it, and then somehow over time you put the capital in the ground, and then you have to recover the costs over a long period of time. And at the same time, people are moving out of some of these towns. And so the costs keep rising, and the customer base to pay for it shifts and changes. So that can be a real challenge in many of our communities. Next slide, please. So here's an example when we talk about limited resources to pay. There are segments of the community, if you look at median household income, if you're sitting that median is right in the middle, right? So there are folks above who perhaps in a community looking at Princeton it doesn't really seem to affect a huge segment of that population's ability to pay compared with Trenton. So the tools in the toolkit that Princeton would have to address this affordability challenge are different than what they would be in Trenton, right? There's the customer base. And so looking at different approaches to addressing the challenge based on the specifics of the community. Next slide, please. So there are federal solutions to the challenge. I mentioned the decline over time in federal infusions to our water infrastructure. There are solutions to that challenge. Next slide, please. So there are local, state, and federal roles in addressing the challenge. At the local level, we're looking at utilities and reducing their cost of provision and changing the amounts that are charged, customer assistance programs, and then the federal and state government stepping in, looking at funding and financing and supporting those customer assistance programs. That's that CAPS is the shorthand for that. Next slide, please. So what can utilities do to help address this challenge that their customers or segments of their customer population are facing? Click, please. They can reduce the costs of providing water, and there are some efficiency measures and operational changes that can help reduce the operating and maintenance costs. Next click, please. Looking at regionalization is an option. Regionalization, partnerships, collaboration, they're called all sorts of, just partnering with other utilities to reduce the cost per customer and enjoying some economies of scale in providing those services. Next click, please. Adopting new technologies. There are things that can reduce labor costs in the form of technology, but making sure they're right sized to the community and the community is ready to accept those technologies is an important factor there. Next click, please. Encouraging conservation. So overall conservation, I've talked with many utility providers who don't like to talk about conservation too much because they will say they're in the business of selling water. But there's lots of good evidence and good studies out there. The Alliance for Water Efficiency has done some really good work in this area to show how conservation in the long run reduce capital costs and can also reduce some of those operating costs, such as power for pumping and chemical treatment, et cetera. Next click, please. Operational efficiencies, I touched on this a little bit, making sure that you're shoring up the leaky pipes and the leaky systems, looking at that day-to-day ways of managing minute to minute, hour to hour, the operations. There can be some cost savings in there. I would throw in there procurement, going along with another utility to get your average costs down is another operational efficiency. Next slide, or next click, please. And then changing the amount customers are charged, specifically that segment of the population that struggles to pay. Next click, please. Innovative rate setting can get you there. There are a lot of things that can look at the percent of a bill that is fixed and that a customer has no control over. There, where you could set different blocks in different places, and how you base your rates can all lead to better affordability for customers who struggle to pay. Next click, please. And then customer assistance programs. I think Larry's going to touch on this a little bit more, but these are, the assistance to help month to month, year to year, based on a set of criteria. It's much more common in the energy space, where there are broader federal programs, but some individual water utilities do have customer assistance programs. Next slide, please. So the caps, when we're talking about that is a recurring bill assistance to help low-income households. And so some examples are bill discounts, special rate structures. There are a couple cities, Philadelphia is one of them, that has an income-based rate structure. Typically, one utility would need to partner pretty closely with with those who are more customer-facing kind of agencies within that community to help make sure that those get delivered properly and effectively and efficiently, and that folks get to actually take advantage of them. Next slide, please. So federal and state governments, what are they doing to help address the challenge? Well, funding and financing water infrastructure for one, and also supporting the customer assistance programs. There were dollars that came out of the ARPA funds and the CARES Act to support customer assistance programs. They were fairly limited and came down to the states. And I know in our state, there are folks taking advantage of that right now. And the hope was that in some states that we could leverage that moment with the federal assistance coming in to create some state programs as well, so that there would be more of a foundation and standing up a more long-lasting program in that regard. Next slide, please. So the sources of funds for capital investments in drinking water systems are this is loans from municipal bonds and banks. So that's where we're talking about. This is coming from, most of them, the 48% of them is coming from municipal bonds and banks. And then the other 31% is from revenues. So looking at those as being locally funded, right? Loans from state and regional authorities, 10%. The DWSRF, you all probably know by now, is the Drinking Water State Revolving Funds. It's only 7% of the funding is coming from there. And then government grants such as the USDA, rural development, et cetera, another 2%. Next slide, please. So the state revolving funds, how do those work in helping with affordability? You all have had a lot of background on this already, but just as a reminder, the states set the eligibility criteria and solicit. They basically wait for utilities to apply. Then the utilities apply for those funds. States seek public comment. It goes out for public comment. And then based on the criteria and the eligibility that they've set, they rank the projects. And based on that ranking and the amount of funds that state has available in that any given year, they commit the funds to specific projects. So then the borrowers construct the projects and the states reimburse the systems for expenses. I will say that piece about getting from state setting eligibility criteria to seeking actually utilities getting the funds in hand require a lot of steps and can often require some expenditures of funds that some utilities may not have available. Next slide, please. Providing low interest loans and some grants to communities on the revolving loan program side. You've learned about principal forgiveness. So that's a way to look at for disadvantaged communities and certain categories of expenditures to basically have a zero interest loan or a negative interest loan. Next slide, please. And then each state does have a program for clean water and drinking water. So the wastewater and the drinking water side. Okay, next slide. So our research has shown that while these programs have been around for a very long time, the number of systems receiving them is not particularly high. And the population served is receiving the funding is not particularly high as well. I mentioned some of those barriers. It can cost money to apply. It can be really overwhelming to apply. And a lot of small systems in particular are very, very busy trying to run their systems, and people are wearing multiple hats. And they are concerned about all of the requirements that go into applying. Next slide, please. So the help is on the way is the good news. The amount and type of assistance in the bipartisan infrastructure law has expanded the opportunity to get more utilities applying and receiving funds than we've had in the past, and particularly disadvantaged communities, and connecting with them with that piece that is principal forgiveness, so that they don't need to front the costs in order to receive the funding. So you can see that it's an extensive expansion. The guardrails have definitely changed in terms of what's available. And so the question is, can we use this moment to connect these utilities with these dollars to deliver more affordable water? Next slide, please. So encouraging utilities that serve the overburdened, and most of the revolving funds refer to this as disadvantaged communities. It changes, it varies state by state. Encouraging them to apply. Next slide, please. It's an important piece of undergirding affordability. Because the benefits are undeniable. Even if a community does not qualify, say, for principal forgiveness and has to pay something on these loans, even a small reduction in interest rates can result in significant savings over time. And then on the principal forgiveness side of things, it's undeniable that disadvantaged communities are better served by receiving principal forgiveness and not needing to pay up front for these services. And then there are also some new principal forgiveness carve-outs for categorical activities such as LSL replacement and PFAS. Next slide, please. So I believe Janet may have touched on this, and just a reminder that EPICS has a program, and I'm the director of the new program, to try to connect these communities more efficiently and effectively using a team of experts with funding and finance, community engagement, technical assistance to try to make sure that we're using this moment to achieve results. There are lots of incredible technical assistance providers out there who have been serving our communities very, very well. And so we're trying to look at a little bit different model. It's all hands on deck, everybody kind of playing a role, and this is what we see perhaps our role could be. Next slide, please. And then basically our four roles is to really go out there and recruit those communities that could benefit the most from receiving these funds. So rather than sitting and waiting for a utility to apply, going out and making them aware and actively recruiting them and trying to connect them, then rapidly diagnosing their problems and helping them assess which should be the priorities for tackling. And then matching them and providing some seed money for technical assistance providers who can help them address the problems and design projects. And what we feel is very important is having community involvement in this priority setting. And so making sure that these projects are truly reflective, and the solutions that come out of this process are really reflecting that specific community's needs. And then finally, helping water systems complete those applications and successfully being awarded principal forgiveness and low interest loans. So that is my final slide. I don't know, Erin and Shada, if you would like to do questions now or wait till the end. I'm open to whatever y'all prefer.
I think we were planning to move straight into our next presentation and save for kind of a combined
Sounds good.
answer. So Larry, if you're ready.
Okay, great. Let me just pull up my screen share here. Okay, is that visible now? Great. And so I'm just trying to find the start slideshow button. Okay, great. Well, thanks, y'all. It's great to be here. Again, I'm Larry Levine with Natural Resources Defense Council. I do a lot of work on water affordability issues, as well as work on water infrastructure funding. Most of you are probably familiar with NRDC, but we're a national and international environmental advocacy organization. We do a lot of work in the US, both at the federal level and at the state and local levels, very often in partnership with state, regional, and local groups. So I'm going to talk about some additional angles of how SRFs connect up directly with affordability issues. It's a little bit of a grab bag, I'll say. And there's some things in here that are meant to call your attention to some specific policies or practices that are already in place, and also some ideas to get you thinking, I hope, about other ways that advocates can use the SRFs as leverage, essentially, to try to help make progress on affordability at the household level. Okay. So as Denise said, when you talk about affordability, the household level and the sort of community level, the utility system level. I'm going to focus mainly on the household level, but just first to start, the most obvious connection between the SRFs and keeping water affordable for individual households, for low-income households, is, as Denise was saying, the way that SRFs can help decrease the costs of providing service, providing lower cost financing, providing grants, ways that decrease the total amount of expense to the utility that's going to end up getting passed through to customers. So that's sort of the most obvious connection. That's the most obvious way in which the SRFs work, right? And the purpose of the additional billions of dollars from the bipartisan infrastructure law to help defray some of those costs that are otherwise borne locally by customers. And that redounds to the benefit of everyone, including low-income households. But there are some more specific connections directly at the household level. Apologies, my advancing the slide is not working that well. There we go. Okay. So here are some connections that I want to highlight and encourage folks to be thinking about. So the SRFs obviously are a big positive, right? But there actually are some unintended consequences and barriers that are created if the connections and implications for household affordability are not fully appreciated and addressed in policy and practices of the state programs. So an SRF loan, which is how most of the money has been historically provided, and there's some shift in that now with the bipartisan money, much more available in grants, but still mostly loans. A loan has to be paid back, right? And that money's got to come from somewhere. And where does it come from? It comes from customers of the utility, right, who are billed for services, and that revenue that's generated is what the utility has to cover its operating costs and its capital costs, and that all goes into paying back loans. So while they're subsidized loans, if they are loans and if they're not forgiven as principal forgiveness, then they are loans that need to be paid back, and there's a cost to that. And when you've got real affordability challenges in a community, the need to pay back those loans can actually be a barrier even to taking advantage of what the SRFs have to offer. Right? It can be a barrier not only for taking advantage of subsidized loans, but also a barrier to taking advantage of grants that are available. Right? And so the reason there is, if you've got a project, you're trying to seek SRF assistance for it, there may be grants available to you or principal forgiveness, you meaning the community or the utility, right? But it may not cover the full cost of the project. And if it doesn't, where does the rest come from? And typically where the rest will come from, again, is borrowing, right? It often can be borrowing through an SRF program. It might be municipal bonds, but SRF programs will very often combine grant and loan money. And they may have caps on how much grant money an individual project can get. Right, but you can't even tap into that grant money if you don't have a way to pay for the rest of the project that you can afford. Right, so dealing with affordability issues is really critical to being able to take advantage of sort of the best that the SRFs can offer. Right, and the SRF programs thinking about how caps on available grant money for an individual project or an individual community, thinking about how those caps affect the ability to participate in the SRF program at all is, I think, something that we all can be thinking about as we're reviewing state intended use plans and otherwise doing advocacy at the state level around this program and around equitable allocation of funds and bringing in more communities into the program. One thing that has been very little used and probably very little known, I'm going to guess, is that under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, this is not true for drinking water, but under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, there is a provision in federal law that allows a state to actually use SRF funds directly for low-income customer assistance. The provision is a little bit odd, I'll say. What it says is there are, as I'm sure has been covered in many of these webinars, and many of you know, there are criteria under the SRF for who's eligible to get a grant or principal forgiveness rather than a loan. The main way in which you qualify for that is if you meet if the community meets the state's affordability criteria, which really are sort of unaffordability criteria, right? It's if you, by certain metrics that the state comes up with, are considered to have an affordability challenge. And that then puts you in a category of being able to get, to the extent available, to get grants or forgivable loans rather than a loan you need to pay back. What this provision in the federal law that governs the Clean Water SRF says is that if you're not one of those communities, if you don't qualify to get a forgivable loan or a grant on that basis of affordability challenges, but if you do have a situation where low-income household customers within your service area are going to be adversely affected by rate increases that are needed to pay back your SRF loan, the state can actually help you tap into some of the SRF dollars to use to fund, say, a customer assistance program. But to use those dollars to directly offset rate increases to those low-income customers in order to help the community be able to take that loan, raise rates to pay back the loan, but raise rates in a way that is not harming those who just can't afford to pay the rate increase. Many people will be able to afford a rate increase in a community, others may not. So this is it's an interesting provision that's in the Clean Water SRF legislation. The only state I've ever come across, and there may be others, but the only one I've ever come across that seems to have tried to use this is Delaware, at least for a time. I'm not sure if they're still doing it. But it is something to be thinking about, especially with all these additional dollars coming through now. If you were to look at EPA's guidance on the bipartisan infrastructure law, they do note this as one of the eligible uses of dollars. of dollars for principal forgiveness or grants. So again, for a community that can't get the principal forgiveness or grant for the capital costs, they may be able to get it for helping individual low-income households through a targeted assistance program. Another thing to think about is if the community is getting that loan, they've got to pay it back. If you don't get that help from the state, think about pairing it with a locally funded affordability or assistance program, right? That can be again a way. This raises all the questions of how do you fund it. There are answers and challenges to that, but where a community is looking at the need to raise rates in order to participate in the SRF program, in order to have revenue to pay back the loan, that's a good opportunity for advocates to be focusing on, okay, this is great. We've got this subsidized loan. It's going to help make it easier to make the investments we need, but there are going to be impacts from a rate increase that some people are not going to be able to afford. Let's at the same time take this opportunity to focus on low-income affordability, to figure out what the utility can do to address that. Keep them hand in hand, right? So here's some other thoughts. There's the SRF affordability criteria I mentioned, right? The criteria that a state looks to, and the state sets, has a lot of discretion to set on whether a community can qualify for grants or principal forgiveness. The criteria that states use typically are not looking at the question of cost burdens for low-income households in particular. They're often looking at sort of community, socioeconomic, demographic factors that are not particular to what the cost of water is in that community, or the cost of water specifically for low-income households and their ability to pay. There's an opportunity to build into these affordability criteria metrics that actually do look directly at that. There's a potential for states to develop affordability criteria that help to prioritize communities where there is a particular affordability challenge for low-income households to be the communities that are receiving grants for their capital projects. Denise may be able to, in Q&A, may have some further thoughts actually on states that might be doing things like that already. I think if I recall, Georgia and/or North Carolina, maybe a couple of places that have a little bit of that in their sort of affordability criteria. To be honest, I actually am not sure if they're looking at, I'd have to go back and look, whether they're looking at rates as a share of low-income households. They may be looking at it in comparison to median household income, another issue. But looking at the cost of water as an actual direct factor in the affordability criteria is something that many states are not doing, but could be developed further. Another one that I think states are not doing, I'd love to hear any examples if anyone knows. States have a lot of discretion in a lot of ways under the SRF program. They're not tons of strings attached at the federal level. There are some, but a lot of discretion given to states. And they could use that discretion to put some qualifiers on conditions on the communities that are benefiting from the program. The state can say, if you want to get assistance from the SRF, you've got to do some things to make sure that you're providing affordable access to these essential services to the most vulnerable people in your community. Right? That could take the form of, for example, some transparency or reporting requirements at a minimum. Right? If you want to get these these dollars, you've got to do some transparency, some data reporting on shutoffs, for example. You've got to provide some information on what the typical bills are in your community and how that relates to the income distribution in your community. You've got to shed some daylight on these issues so that we, the state, can understand that, so that the general public and policymakers and researchers and everyone else can understand that and be able to get a better handle to start with on what the issues are and where the issues are. Right. Going beyond that, you could, of course, impose some more substantive requirements. Right. You could say that if you want to get this money, you've got to come up with a plan. You've got to show us that you're actually going to do something to ensure that water is affordable for low-income households. That you can't just take this money, raise rates to pay it back, and if some people get left behind because they can't afford the bill, so be it. Right? A state could say, no, you've got to focus on that. We want to help you, but we've also got to make sure that that help is being used in a way that lifts up everybody. Right, so these are just some thoughts, some ideas on just the way that a state might attach some strings to the money. Right, the utilities never like strings. Right, so they're not going to be happy about this idea. Right, but one way of looking at the world is, if the state's going to benefit the community's got to be doing its part. By the community, I mean here the utility, the municipality. Right, they've got to be doing their part to ensure that everyone is benefiting from this, to ensure that everyone's got access to this essential service that the state is trying to support. Okay, here's a couple more. Some of you may be familiar, including from emails from me or colleagues this week, about familiar with EPA's Financial Capability Assessment Guidance. Right, this is something that comes up in the Clean Water Act context for wastewater, stormwater. It also does have some implications for drinking water. And what this is, it's a guidance from EPA that explains how the agency will consider the financial capacity of the utility, community scale, to pay for infrastructure upgrades, how they'll consider that in connection with compliance and enforcement under the Clean Water Act. How much time is a community going to get to reduce their sewage overflows or eliminate overflows, for example? Right? If they're struggling financially, they may get more time. Right? How do you measure what struggling financially means, and how do you respond when there are struggles? Do you respond by saying, okay, you get more time, right? Poor communities can keep being polluted, or do you respond by trying to solve those affordability challenges, those financial capability challenges, right? And so what EPA is currently proposing in draft revisions to that guidance, and comments are due on that on Monday, is to say, if the analysis shows that there are affordability challenges, right, and those may arise in terms of the household level in this under this guidance, or in terms of the community's finances, bond rating, other factors like that. Right? But if those various factors, the way that the guidance looks at them, add up to we've got an affordability challenge, you've got to go and see what can you do to better your situation. What can you do to avoid having unaffordable water bills for low-income customers, other than just deferring compliance with key environmental and public health protections. Right? And so what they've got in this guidance is what they're calling a financial alternatives analysis. Right? So if you find that there are these challenges that might provide an argument for a longer compliance schedule, don't just go straight to the longer schedule. EPA is saying we want to make sure that this utility looks at all the kinds of things that Denise just talked about. Looks at, are we really taking out the best advantage we can of available grants and subsidized loans? Are we looking at our rate structures and the possibility of customer assistance programs or affordability programs to help mitigate cost burdens on low-income households? Are we diverting ratepayer funds for other purposes in the general municipal budget. They're driving up rates, and we really shouldn't be doing that. And if we stop doing that, it's going to take some pressure off of rates and make things more affordable, right? There's a checklist they've got, which I think is pretty decent, and includes many of the things that Denise has identified. And this guidance, this revised guidance, provides an opportunity for local advocates to really kind of leverage opening up this discussion around affordability, right? If you've got an enforcement action going on, if you've got a permit renewal going on under Clean Water Act where there are some expensive compliance costs, this provides an opportunity to say to that utility, to that municipality, hey, wait a second, we got to deal with these issues, and you can't kind of get away with it in the regulatory context unless you really drill down and try to focus on this and do everything that can be done. Right? Getting SRF funds, getting into the SRF program if you're not in it, that's one of those things on the checklist, but doing all these other things around household level affordability are also there. Right? So there's an opportunity here. The guidance hasn't been finalized yet, but as I said, there's comments due on Monday. I'd expect that the final version is going to include this sort of approach in it. Two more, and then I'll stop. There's connected with the SRF programs, the periodic drinking water needs survey, clean water needs surveys done every handful of years. They often run behind schedule. But this is another opportunity for some transparency, for some data gathering. Those needs surveys are meant to identify what the needs for investment are by water and wastewater utilities. But there's no reason why a state couldn't choose to solicit or require some additional data when they do those needs surveys. And again, that kind of data collection could focus on issues relating to affordability, which would in fact help illustrate needs, financial needs, but would also provide data that can be very helpful to crafting the whole range of solutions. Right, and then last, and this is also I think a point that Denise alluded to. Certainly, utilities can use SRF funds in ways that will help reduce costs in the long run, which again reduces costs for everyone, including low-income households, helps to keep bills more affordable. Right, so the things that can ultimately pay for themselves. Right, get an SRF loan or grant to do something that will help reduce cost, help replace leaky pipes, leaky water mains, prevent water main breaks that are losing water, that are costing money to treat that water, to pump that water. Nobody's using that water, but people are ultimately getting billed for it because the cost of pumping and treating that water gets factored into everybody's rates. Right, it's literally money down the drain. I suppose not the drain because it's actually into the ground before it reaches the home. Right, but that's an example of cost-saving infrastructure investment. Right, investing in more energy efficient pumps, for example, or other components of a treatment system. Right, there's the Camden County Municipal Utilities Authority in New Jersey. Andy Cricken is the former executive director of that and is now a fellow with U.S. Water Alliance and very active in this space. And he often tells the story of how over a period of a couple decades, he at that utility was able to tap into SRF money in ways that built projects that reduced operating costs and keep rates steady. Improve the system while keeping rates steady. And so that's just one more thing to think about. What are the projects that funds are being sought for? Not everything is going to pay for itself or save money, but including within the scope of the infrastructure improvements that the utility is looking to make, including those things that can help to pay for themselves, where there's a financial return on the investment, to the utility and not only a health and environmental return on the investment. And that's, I think, where I'll stop. And I hope some of that was informative and or thought-provoking. Love to hear questions.
Thank you so much, Larry. And I think so we're going to move into questions for both you and Denise, and we've been capturing some of your questions in the chat. So I'm going to start out with some questions for you, Denise, and combine some of them here. I know Yasmina to drop off, but she asked one of the questions around the funding navigator that EPIC is starting, and specifically which your utilities you're targeting in each state, or maybe specific states that you're working in. And then also the relationship between the funding navigator work with environmental finance centers.
Sure, yeah. Love to talk more about that. So we are looking at pilot programs in the Great Lakes State, Michigan. We've stood up a navigator in Michigan that's already taking inquiries in the Mid-Atlantic and the South. So our role with recruitment, I think, was the first question, and outreach, looking at utilities that have not classically or historically received funds or applied, and looking at the demographics of the community. Are they considered disadvantaged? Cross-referencing those. Are they communities that could benefit from green infrastructure? Larry's talking about better projects and how can we direct these funds in a way that makes them more resilient, sustainable, environmentally responsible. So we're identifying those communities that have historically stood back, have not been successful, have maybe applied and weren't successful, and have needs. And there are, in each state, there are the sanitary survey reports. Are there needs identified? And those reports, or other different states have those more accessible than others, but cross-referencing where there are needs with where we could link that assistance. So there was another question in there. Oh, with the EFCMs, yes. So we have, as advisors, and the folks who have developed this idea and this vision have included the EFCMs, so the South, and specifically the Southwest Environmental Finance Center Network, and they are involved in proposals we're putting together, in the concept development, and they will be involved in providing technical assistance and helping do the needs assessments and doing kind of that rapid assessment. Larry, you mentioned Andy's work kind of built on that concept of it may be a project, it may be a solution that's not a project that doesn't require funding, but it could indeed help provide more affordable service in that community. So that's a little bit of a snapshot there.
Thank you. And then the next question I wanted to pose is to you again, Denise. I think you touched very briefly on regionalization as a mechanism to support affordability, but we've got a comment here from Monica about questioning how equity and justice is being discussed when thinking about regionalization, and thinking specifically about the Detroit example, where I'm thinking about water democracy and specifically the language of this process being weaponized against residents and owners.
Oh, for sure. It is not, I think that there are some core principles that everyone has to agree on when looking for cost savings through economies of scale and regional approaches or collaboration. One, it can be like, it doesn't have to be full on somebody else is owning your system, right, and running it on your behalf. It can be, partnering on procurement or other O&M things, but really where the cost driver is, as I mentioned, it's in the capital investment. So going along with your neighboring system to make sure you have equal representation and adequate representation if one were to decide on joint delivery of service or a joint source of supply. I think though, it absolutely, if it's not community driven and there is not adequate representation and involvement every step of the way, then it's a non-starter. It's not going to happen. It's not going to be successful. It's not going to achieve the savings that were envisioned. I will say, kind of at the local level, there's kind of like big advocacy at the state level, right? And then there's advocacy at the local level. I will say, What I observed in my role is somebody who approved projects from an economic standpoint and looked at the things Larry was talking about. Where are these rates going to land after this project? That was a key requirement of every application to us. The community involvement during the project ideation and development stage was pretty much lacking altogether. And if it was done sort of after the fact, when the community already had sort of a loan on the line, and now you're going to hold us back from getting this low interest financing. It needs to be from the beginning, and it needs to be authentic and legitimate, and it needs to be informed by information. So there's kind of like, information going both ways. So I think that's when we start envisioning a new world of water utility provision. I think that has to be at the heart of it, whether it involves regional approaches or just a simple local approval of a project.
Thanks, Denise. And I guess I just have one follow-on to that, and that is, are there any examples of regionalization that you think have been done well, or are in progress that you could point to?
There are some interesting examples. It is the North Little Rock water utility system. Interestingly, it's my understanding that driver had to do primarily with the commercial and business community really kind of saying enough, enough of this bickering. Your systems are this close, cheek by jowl. It's time to get together and do some cost savings. I also find the co-op model very interesting. So you help ensure that you have that adequate representation. I think, again, there's some core principles I think you need to kind of follow on that. And I think there's a co-op model that could work really well. It's the EJ Water Cooperative, operates in the state of Illinois, and they aren't even connected systems. They're disparate systems. So I believe they do cost averaging in terms of setting their rates. Some states won't allow this, right? But other states, the co-ops sort of don't get regulated from an economic standpoint. So there's some opportunity there. I think that model could be a good one.
Thanks, Denise. I think we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I am going to move us on and to a question that I think both you and Larry could have some input on about using Clean Water State Revolving Fund money towards customer assistance programs to offset rate increases, and just that we know that customer assistance programs can have low rates of participation. Are there best practices for increasing CAP participation, or any other thoughts on that?
Larry, would you like to take that one?
Sure. Or hang on, let me pull up something on that. Or if you want to start, there's also, EPIC did recently a report on very much that question, right? What are some of the reasons why existing utility level customer assistance programs are coming up short, and what are some solutions to that?
Yeah, I think where we've seen it work, and where we had a chance to look at some of these, I think it's called LIWAP, right? That's the Federal Water Assistance Program. I think that's what we're calling it. Bringing that in and making sure that it's not duplicating services, duplicating efforts. I think making sure that it's going through a service that is on the ground and has that connection with the community, so that you can bundle the needs in one place. So if you're getting energy assistance, do you understand that there's water assistance available? I think it's raising the awareness, because there are concerns. I get concerned a bit that the administrative costs will outpace the benefits received, and then all the ratepayers are paying for these added costs. And including the folks that can ill afford to pay. So I think there needs to be some really strategic thinking about who's already on the ground, rather than creating like this separate branch of the utility that is now doing something very new that isn't at the part of their core function, or what they're accustomed to being their core function. Much as they are anchor institutions in our communities, just kind of being real about the capacity to make a program work.
And I'll add a few other examples. One is just the difficulty level of applying for a program. Right? There's a cost to a customer of spending the time to try to get through a bureaucratic process if it's a time-consuming bureaucratic process, right? And that's a deterrent to participating. So there are various ways to streamline application processes. One example is what's called categorical eligibility, right? Rather than having somebody have to document their income and various other factors, if you've already qualified for and you're participating in some other sort of means tested assistance program, right? Not necessarily for water, right? It could be SNAP, food stamps, right? It could be LIHEAP, energy utility assistance. It could be various other sorts of benefits programs. If you can show that you're already participating in that, then the utility could say, okay, anybody in that, we're going to treat you as qualified. You don't have to jump through all the hoops again. Right, that's one very straightforward way to lower barriers to entry to participating in a program. It's something that some states are doing under the LIWAP program. It's something that some states do under the LIHEAP energy assistance program. There may be in some instances opportunities even to go further and if you can have data exchanged around this automatic enrollment. People who already are getting one benefit to get into another. So that's one, I think, example that can be very effective at cutting through some of the challenges of getting people to apply. Right. There's also just all of the things that go into outreach to making sure that again, as Denise said, utilities partnering with trusted partners in the community who are able to reach the communities most in need and support them in doing the application process.
Great, thank you. And I see Monica is also sharing some examples of effective customer assistance program administration from Detroit. The next question I wanted to ask was from Debbie about when in the SRF process do states do their needs assessment survey. She's saying that her state hands out SRF on a quarterly basis and take applications all the time. When do they need to do their needs assessment?
Yeah, so the formal needs assessment that I was referring to is something that's required by statute by Congress. The EPA coordinates with the states are the ones that are really gathering the data. There's a 3 or 5 year cycle, maybe a different length of time for clean water and drinking water, I forget. But that's sort of a formalized process, that every state needs to do periodically using an EPA questionnaire. But my suggestion that there's no reason a state should have to limit itself to that, right? When a state is reaching out to utilities and saying, we want to get this XYZ information, seek more information.
For that clarification. And then a question from Ellen about wondering if an assessment shows an affordability challenge, whether that should result in immediate qualification for grant programs and/or other assistance programs.
Yeah, I mean, and that sort of it comes back a bit to the point I was making about the affordability criteria for the SRF, for purposes of the SRF, right? Looking at some of those same factors that would suggest a financial capability challenge from the compliance perspective, looking at some of those same things as the basis for qualifying for grants or loans, for grants or forgivable loans. And that's in this EPA guidance. That is something that they sort of allude to. It's kind of beyond the 4 corners of that guidance itself, because the guidance is about EPA and states' compliance enforcement activities. But they do say, that would be great. We'd encourage states to be doing that. And the focus really of the place where more of the energy is being put directly into those things is, of course, in the implementation of bipartisan infrastructure law and the kinds of guidance that EPA is putting out around that, the oversight that EPA is going to be giving to the state's intended use plans, which each state is going to need to submit to EPA for review and approval. Again, although the states have a lot of discretion, EPA is trying to lean in more than they have before on encouraging states in a positive direction on that.
Thank you. And I guess,
oh, excuse me, if I might add, then Larry, something you said, I think is really resonates. And I think, as you know, that it was a principle of ours in approving projects, but I think anytime you're embarking on a major capital project, if you're not doing not just an estimated rate impact, but a rate profile, right? Impact of the profile of the community, because that will tell you what tool would be most appropriate at the local or the state level. Yeah, that's all I had in that.
thank you. And I want to respond to a comment that I received from Monica as we were having this conversation about water affordability, and it's interspersed with conversations about customer assistance. Just wanted to make the distinction between water affordability and customer assistance. Customer assistance being something that addresses the issue by providing funding for those who are unable to afford their bills, but water affordability is a much more long-term game about systemically addressing the issue of water not being affordable for all those who need it, being all of us. So I just wanted to address that. I think we might be using these terms a little bit interchangeably here and maybe inadvertently using them synonymously, but they are different. So I just wanted to address that. And then we did have a question from Ellen as well about hearing about more examples of affordability criteria. Ellen, I don't know if there's something specific.
Yeah, that was just in relation to Larry's point about, you mentioned that Georgia might have something, North Carolina might have something. I don't know if anybody else on this call has any examples of those kinds of different kinds of affordability metrics. It would be great to start compiling a list of those, examples.
And Denise, last I had heard from some of your colleagues, EPIC was working on compiling some of that. I don't know if you know where that stands right now.
Well, it's my 4th week, so I'll have to get back to you. I know somebody's probably working on it, but yeah, I know that's part of the compiling the data piece of it, and that I think that even in our state, there are different affordability criteria for different carve-outs, right, for different pieces of the SRF program, which can get confusing. We were able to get a different affordability metric for lead service line replacement and 100% principal forgiveness versus the regular SRF program. So even when you're tracking it, you have to make sure you're tracking every piece of it.
I had a question to Larry, your point about how states can kind of attach strings to projects, saying like, if you're going to do this, you have to consider affordability. Would that typically be done through rulemaking at the agency level or through legislation?
Good question. Yeah, it may vary from state to state how much authority the agency has to do that by rulemaking versus being constrained by existing legislation in the state. I would venture to guess that many states probably could do it without legislation. Just sort of an educated guess. Yeah, certainly any state could do it through legislation, but if you got a friendly administration and an agency, that's going to be an easier route than getting a bill introduced and passed. And I would bet that there is the opportunity to do that in many places. I would certainly think that the reporting sorts of strings would be a lot easier. A lighter lift. Less likely, I would think, to run into questions about whether there's authority, whether the agency has authority to require it. And on the substantive sort of strings that I was suggesting. I think the more that a state is able to offer some resources to help with those substantive conditions, the more likely it's going to be, I think, that there could be some political acceptance to that. So just one example, in Michigan, there's a program right now where the state appropriated some funds for grants to communities to do local affordability plans. Right. If you were to have, say, strings attached to SRF money that said, if you're going to take this money, you've got to come up with a plan for how you're going to make sure bills remain affordable for low-income households. And you also said, and we'll help you with that planning. That certainly could make things more politically feasible and and actually more effective.
Great. I think the next question is from James about the implementation memo and how it encourages states to update their affordability criteria for the clean water SRF as well as disadvantaged communities definitions for the drinking water SRF. But it is not a requirement. I recognize that EPA has said they are going to pay special attention to these updates, but just a general question about what can we do to ensure that these metrics actually ensure grant funding goes to those communities that need it most. So just any reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, what to do? I mean, most directly, I think, is engaging at the state level when states are developing their intended use plans. And that's typically where the affordability criteria will show up and where the state agency has an opportunity to change what those criteria are. Interacting with the EPA regional office, the folks there who oversee implementation of the SRF program, telling them what's important to you, what the concerns are that you see about what your state has done historically, and trying to get them to be allies in pushing the state in the right direction as well. I think, as with most things in advocacy, the earlier you get in and start having these conversations, the better. Once there is a formal rule proposal or formal draft of something out for the kind of formal notice and comment period, once they've gotten to that point, it's less likely they're going to make substantial changes. And the more you can do, not impossible, and I wouldn't discourage anybody from commenting and trying to do that at all. But the earlier you can get in to try to influence what that initial proposal looks like, the better chance you'll have of getting to where you want to go.
Thanks, Larry. And I guess I just want to flag too, I shared the link for the previous two sessions at the beginning of this, but our second session really did go in deep on definitions of disadvantaged communities with Janet's presentation, as well as the intended use plan process that Larry's referring to. So I'll share that in the chat again, and we're going to follow up with slides and a recording of this session as well, just FYI. But we've just got a few minutes left, so I'm going to take these. I think we'll end with Monica and Victoria's questions. They're combined about workforce development strategies being paired with SRFs at the state level, and local and targeted hiring strategies. If you all have any reflections on that. And Monica is also referring to the Justice 40 strategy to increase the number of disadvantaged communities, tribes, BIPOC communities, et cetera, that are able to take advantage of the historic investments and create economic development and creating jobs and contracts and training.
So is that a yes, and so in Wisconsin, I think it was for the 2020 reporting year, asked that all utilities report on their workforce diversity. And it was across the state and got a lot of calls from utility managers after we put that out there. And I said, I could walk them through the conversation. Well, I'm hearing a lot about your workforce challenges. is this not an opportunity to both lift up and fulfill your need for people to run your utility? So trying to make those connections, yes, I think there's a real concern that there aren't enough people to carry out and build these things right now. And I do know that utility, particularly the operations crews, are being diverted to much better, higher paying jobs in the construction industry. So yeah, it's a great moment to try to do a bigger picture look at this. Agreed. I don't know, Larry, if you have anything on that.
Or Monica or Victoria, if you want to speak to it any more of like where you are hitting roadblocks, or yeah, where you are at in the conversation and thinking about workforce development.
We're actually having some state level conversations and regional conversations, because some of our partners like in Ohio and Illinois have been more successful in creating those relationships to talk about how to move forward from an equity and justice framework. Case in point would be Toledo Junction has done an amazing job of being able to build out those relationships across the state of Ohio. Some of what we're struggling with in Michigan is that it is to the benefit of the suburbs, and many of those labor unions have now moved out of and vacated the city of Detroit. So there's no longer an allegiance to the city of Detroit nor the residents of Detroit. And so as the unions are getting wider, they're also getting more conservative. And they're also many times taking positions that are against even what has been historic union positions in the state of Michigan. So I think that we're at a place of what I would say growing pains. As they've tried to grow the union base, they've also brought in some elements that don't always carry the same values that the union has held dear for so long. So I think it's become extremely difficult. And then we know the union itself, even when it was in Michigan heavily democratically leaning, has not always been very, I would say, forward leaning in making sure that persons of color, women are getting into the trades. It's pretty much been a very white male dominated kind of career path. And so we too agree, Shada and others, we see it as an opportunity to really grow that presence, that footprint, to diversify with getting more women of color, more persons of color, not only into the water sector, but hopefully this will connect them to caring more about water itself.
I also really quick want to add that for the folks on the labor side who we've been talking to, there are people who, they're open to the idea of, Justice 40, the goals and the mission of it, and they just don't know where to start. And that's what we've heard from some of those groups as well. So just trying to be in conversation with others to see if they have any ideas of where we might be able to help bridge that gap between our goals and their goals, and putting under this umbrella of Justice 40.
Awesome. Thank you.
I think that's a really interesting point, Victoria. I see a lot about maximum flexibility, at the state level, at the local level, and yet at the same time, what I heard oftentimes in my role was just tell us what to do, please, because we, to create this on our own is hard. So somebody lift up an example and a model for us to use.
All right, we are just a minute over time here, so I'm going to let folks hop off. But thank you so much, Denise and Larry, and thank you everyone for joining and for your questions. We will be following up, as I said, with the recording and slides. So thanks again and have a great afternoon.
All right. Take care.